All right, good morning. I'd like to call the March 5th meeting of the Administration and Projects Committee of the Contra Costa Transportation Authority to order. Indicate for the record that all members of the committee are present. The first item on our agenda is public comment. Is there anyone in the audience who wishes to comment on any item not listed on today's agenda? Seeing no one come forward, we will close the public comment period. Go to the approval of the minutes from our February 5th meeting. Any additions, corrections, or a motion?
So moved. Second.
I have a motion by Arnrich, a second by Tatson to approve the minutes. All in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries unanimously. The next item on our agenda this morning is the election of the next APC chair and vice chair for 2015, and I would like to exercise the option of the chair and nominate Don Tatson to be chair and Tom Butt to be our vice chair for 2015. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
I have a second.
Your own deal?
Why not? You can second.
I just welcome you back. I'd like to second.
I will.
Show up and you take over.
I will elect to take the second from Mr. Taylor. Okay. Any further nominations? Hearing none, all in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed? That carries unanimously. Mr. Tatson, it's all yours.
Right, thank you. The next item is the consent calendar. These are items that we will act on in one motion unless any member of staff, the public, or commissioner wishes to remove an item.
Move approval.
Well, let me see if anybody wanted to remove an item first. Okay, seeing none, there's now a motion from Commissioner Pierce, second from Commissioner Arnrich. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. That brings us down to our major discussion items, and the first of those is a legislative update.
Good morning,
Ms.
Commissioners.
Mills. Good morning.
We're going to switch it up a little bit this morning, and I'm going to have Mark Watts come up and do the state legislation first, and then I'll give you a quick update on federal legislation. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mark.
Sorry, I couldn't fit. Two chairs were banging each other. Mr. Chairman, thank you for having me here today. I have a couple things I want to relate to you. First, kind of a little broad brush overview. I've got a few bills I want to bring to your attention, and then I want to talk a little bit at the very end about how you prefer to see the process go forward in terms of tracking legislation. So from an overview picture in Sacramento, things are starting to pick up in terms of interest in transportation finance and funding. People have finally understood that there are issues abounding at both the state and local levels in terms of having the resources to meet all the needs of the state of the people of the state of California. First and foremost, there were several hearings conducted in the last week focusing in on just what is going on in the state of transportation finance. The assembly hearing last Monday featured several speakers, including your executive director, Mr. Iwasaki, who did a great job on behalf of the self-help counties. And it was very informative. The next day was followed up by the Senate Transportation Committee conducting a very similar hearing. So what we're seeing is information about the nature of the funding. I call it crisis. You can use other adjectives or other words, but there is a funding crisis, and we're starting to get our arms around kind of a joint understanding of how big the issue could be. And then I think we'll start seeing a few more folks walking towards solutions. In that vein, Speaker Atkins in early February released a proposal that would generate about a net amount of about $2 billion a year over a 5-year span for a total of $10 billion. Essentially, it would recapture the weight fees that had been part of the tax swap from several years ago, and then partially backfill them, but supplement the total amount. So the back fees are equal to about $1 billion. She would generate about $2 billion, one of which would go to the general fund to backfill the weight fee transfer back to transportation resources. The other $1 billion would be available presumably for local government road maintenance activities. She's not been specific in terms of what form of new revenue. She suggested some sort of a fee on vehicles, but has not been very specific. The fee that would be needed roughly based on the number of cars and depending on how you structured it, would be about $4 a month per vehicle or $50 a year to generate the kind of revenue she was looking at. But she, I think the takeaway we all had in Sacramento is this is the first time we've had a leader of one of the two houses step up with a concept. Whether it's something we endorse or everybody can support or not is a different question, but you're now having leadership coming out of the Speaker's office for the first time since I've worked in Sacramento. We expect the chairs of the two transportation committees to be developing complementary legislation. It hasn't been released yet, but we understand that both of them, Senator Bell for the Senate Transportation Committee and Mr. Frazier here for the Assembly Transportation Committee, and we expect to see something in the coming weeks from both those offices. Probably the biggest issue that laid over Sacramento, and it's really confounding, is the annual adjustment to the Board of Equalization establishment of the tax rate for the second excise tax. The base excise tax is 18 cents a gallon at the state level. The secondary tax, which represents really the former Prop 42 sales tax amount in the form of an excise tax, is required to be adjusted each year based on the Board of Equalization assessing what they think the price of gasoline or fuel is going to be in the coming year. And when it became apparent through the governor's budget that it could have been as great as 7.5 cents reduction, which was in excess of $1 billion in terms of a reduction for STIP and local roads and SHOP at the state level. We went to work. We met with the Board of Equalization management and the board members, but they had felt very firm in terms of their process to get to the number that they got to. Nevertheless, they reduced the target from 7.5 cents to 6 cents reduction, which would be what would go into effect July 1st unless there's a change in law. On that point, there is a bill that's been introduced that would try to do two things. One, extend the period of the look ahead and try to come up with a more smooth and less volatile and abrupt annual adjustment to the tax rate, still keeping in mind that it needs to be revenue neutral over a period of time. And then it secondarily has the ability, or grants the ability of the Board of Equalization, if it were to pass, to make mid-course adjustments if there's a sudden spike or a tremendous drop in the price of fuel that was unanticipated. So that bill just was introduced in the last week and has not had a chance to have folks take a hard look at it. We'll be analyzing it very closely and seeing if that's something as a suitable alternative to the current process. The bills I want to bring to your attention are several. First, in the world of tolling and hot lanes and express lanes, you might recall last year there was a strong effort led by the self-help counties to try to develop a tolling and hot lane legislation. It ultimately failed due to other influences, had nothing to do with the policy at heart. The Self-Help County Coalition has introduced, through Mr. Frazier as the author, AB 194, which would grant regional entities as defined authority to implement hot lanes. In this region, that authority would rest with MTC, and that's an issue that folks are taking a hard look at still. It does require MTC coordinate and consult with the CMAs on an on a project-by-project basis. The administration's trailer bill was posted several weeks back, and it's an alternative that people are still analyzing. There will be a consideration of that in the subcommittees coming up, probably in either very late March or initially, or in mid-April, depending upon the schedule of the subcommittees. Right now, it's looking like one would take it in late March, and the other would take care of it in April. The trailer bill process is it's a high wire act because you get the hearing, you define what you want to see in it, it comes out of that subcommittee and goes to conference committee, and then you don't see it until the budget is finished. So we're going to be watching this and working on this through the budget process to see if we can blend the self-help approach with the administration's approach and come up with a workable solution. An interesting measure was introduced recently, AB 464, and that would address the local sales tax cap. As you recall, it's been 2%. There's been several efforts, including one 2 years ago, to allow certain entities to exceed that cap under certain circumstances. This bill takes a different approach. It just says statewide, the local government sales tax cap is now 3%. So it's an interesting approach. It keeps a cap in place, but it ultimately allows the voters and the electeds to determine if they want to exceed or get into that 3% or 2+% range. So it'll be an interesting bill to take a close look at. Senator Bell introduced a measure relating to the transit and intercity rail program component of the cap and trade funding. This category of cap and trade really is for transit projects and intercity rail projects. It represents about 10% of the cap and trade revenues. Caltrans does the assessment based on submittals. The Secretary's office makes a final cut and authorizes the CTC to then make grant approvals. The senator is trying to make some adjustments to that. He is deleting in his bill any expenditure from this source on any operations. It would just be for capital. He's trying to focus the capital portion of the program now on significant and substantive projects, and uses a $100 million threshold. But most importantly, he authorizes a long-term 5-year programming cycle for these funds. So right now, the issue that's in play is some transit agencies are opposing or concerned about the elimination of operations. Others are concerned that the $100 million might rule them out in terms of being able to be eligible for projects because of that size. So those two issues are under consideration by the author's office right now. The one steady state issue is the long-term programming. The 5-year programming cycle, I think everybody buys into. And in addition, it includes a letter of no prejudice approach, which allows, if you're a selected grantee, you can move forward if you have your own resources and be reimbursed by the fund over time. It's worked well on Prop 1B projects, and they're trying to translate that into this new category. Senator Bell also has a very innovative a bill called SB 16, which would direct Caltrans to develop a $200 million ongoing savings that would carry forward. And I think he intends at the end of the day to redirect those savings back into road maintenance. But he hasn't dropped the second shoe yet, just the first shoe, saying you shall develop a savings program of $200 million from within your budget and bring that to the legislature so they can appropriate it. And finally, of note, Assemblymember Frazier introduced this last week Assembly Constitutional Amendment number 4, which would reduce or propose to reduce the voter threshold to 55% from 2/3. I would just comment, I think it has two challenges. We saw a number of bills last year, several, 4 or 5 I think, in the same vein, but the ones that got the furthest along were compelled to accept amendments that directed certain amounts of that money from an expenditure plan to certain activities, such as sustainable communities, rather than leaving it to the electeds in that community to develop the expenditure plan as they see fit. Secondarily, polling in the last several years does not suggest that the voters would support even the clean version, let alone a more muddied up version of this kind of a reduction. And so I think this bill is going to have to work its way through over 2 years and just see where the voters' attitude is before it moves forward. One last measure that was brought to my attention, AB 1362, pertains to the Prop 218 procedure Act that was developed in 1997 after Prop 218 was approved, that establishes how local entities are to present programs for voter consideration and assessment. And this one would add stormwater to that list of eligible activities that are subject to that act. It's an interesting by note, and I was asked to make sure I brought that to the attention. So those are the legislative items I wanted to bring or highlight now. What I'd like to briefly ask you for some guidance for Lindsay and myself as we move forward. You know, we've prepared a matrix for your consideration, and that allows you to act in on a large number of items at one point in time. And I presume that that's something you'd like to continue with. I just wanted to verify that. I have completed the review of all the bills that were introduced by the February 27th deadline, so I have an initial list I prepared to share. I just wanted to affirm that that's the approach you want, or did you want to have items brought in individually, and I look to you for guidance.
Mark, thank you. I always enjoy listening to your stories. On that last one, I personally like to see the list as it comes available, and then, you know, we kind of, with your guidance and Lindsay's, say, here's the ones we're really interested in, and then if something changes, to keep us filled in. I want to go back a minute to hear your thoughts on the logic on the excise tax. So, they planned a $1 billion reduction. Why?
Okay, so this will be blunt.
Okay.
But accurate, I believe.
That's good.
Okay. So when the tax swap was thought of and conceived of, at that point in time, we had the base excise 18 cents, but we also had Prop 42. And Prop 42 represented the state's portion of the sales tax on gas. And at that point in time, it was worth roughly $1.8 billion. In addition, there had been a long-term effort by various administrations to target what was called the spillover, which was kind of an artifact, kind of a side issue related to how the sales tax on gas generated revenues for the general fund in addition to Prop 42. And it was worth about $1 billion. They had taken that in several years in succession. The Transit Association filed a suit, and the Transit Association won. So consequently, going forward, at that point in time, the administration could no longer grab that transit spillover. But they still wanted $1 billion out of transportation, because this was in 2010 when we were at the height of, or the low part of our budget process. So they conceived of a process that said, we're going to eliminate the sales tax on gas, but we're going to backfill transportation interests with an equal amount of new excise tax. And by the way, this is the administration, we found that the weight fees that were collected, worth about $900 million from truckers, were not protected under Article 19 of the Constitution. They were unfettered. It was an oversight that had been made years before. So they came up with the concept that the sales tax on gas, Prop 42, generated about $1.8 billion. They folded in $1 billion additional and set the new excise tax at 18 cents a gallon, because that raised about $2.5 to $2.6 billion at that point in time. And they took the weight fees to support the transportation debt service from Prop 1B. To do that, at that point in time, they needed to make that transition revenue neutral, because they were doing it with a majority vote measure, because the money equaled each other. So they charged the Board of Equalization with setting the annual excise tax based on a look ahead of what they thought the gas sales tax on gas would have generated, right. And then they were going to adjust that 18 cents up and down. So that's where it came from. And yes, they were looking, Board of Equalization, using international, oil specialist consultants, made a projection that they thought that the price of gas through 2015-16 fiscal year would be in the mid to low $2 per gallon, based on what had happened in the fall and worldwide conditions. So that translated to about a 7.5 cent, initially 7.5 cent reduction proposal to keep the revenue neutrality portion true. And yeah, we tinkered on the edge and got it back down to 6 cents. So it's an $800 million impact, not a $1 billion impact. But that's the backdrop. So the general fund now has that $1 billion benefit. Transportation really is getting, even with that 6 cent reduction, that if it comes online on July 1st, what the sales tax on gas would have generated under Prop 42 is just doesn't feel good.
Yeah.
So we would have suffered, I guess the way to say it is, they're projecting we would have suffered under Prop 42 what they're adopting under their new tax rate.
So is this really all driven through the executive branch, through, quote, a budget process, and it's sort of somewhat bypassing the legislature?
The legislature delegated to the Board of Equalization the responsibility to set the rate.
And they're,
And their hands are tied. They have to make an estimate. Now, if they make an estimate based on consultant input that's irrational, they can be challenged. So, I mean, that's how that would work.
Great, thank you for that.
Yeah, the list of legislative priorities, absolutely. Let's go with that like we always do. And then we have also sort of our tangential items that we identify every year of keep an eye out for kind of things. And then significant changes, absolutely, just keep us apprised. I think that's the cleanest way to go about it. But I realize all of this is a moving target right now. So when we need to chime in, let us know.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
I'm also for the list. I have another question about the cap and trade. Is the bill clear about which intercity rail lines qualify?
It uses a broad term, and so I believe all the lines in the state are qualified.
Okay, because Contra Costa belongs to two of them.
Correct.
Right.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you. All right, so I think we provided direction regarding
I was going to say, thank you for the comments on the matrix. I wanted to just give a quick federal update before we closed out this item, even though there's no action. Sorry. I'll start with that right now.
Right.
So what we've learned on the federal side is both the House and the Senate have started work on the MAP 21 reauthorization process. As you know, they passed a short-term resolution through May of this year. And from what we're hearing from our colleagues, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee will be the first committee to release a draft, kind of a starting point of all the committees that have to weigh in. This is actually really good news for us because for those of you who've traveled in the past to Washington, D.C. With Randy and Ross, this is a committee that our staff has regularly met with, and that's actually really started to pay dividends. Last week, the Senate EPW consultant actually reached out to Randy and Ross to ask for Contra Costa's opinion on a few of the items that they're considering putting in the reauthorization. And so we talked with them about a few things that are in our adopted federal platform. We talked about, the importance of a stable, reliable, long-term source of funding. We mentioned that they should consider rewarding organizations that help themselves, similar to us. 100% federal match for intelligent transportation systems projects, keep the tax-exempt municipal bond market, continue to support TIFIA, and inclusion of a freight title. And I think all of our suggestions were really well received. And I actually recently sat on a call with ITS America, which is another organization we are a member of and we visit with when we go to Washington, D.C., and they have some of the same requests, and they're also hearing that there's going to be an innovation title in the reauthorization to help support these intelligent transportation systems activities, including potentially increased funding for ITS research, and the incorporation of an autonomous or self-driving vehicle program along with the connected vehicle program, and potentially also innovation competitive grants for transportation agencies who are advancing this technology. So this is all really good news for us because this can really accelerate how we expand some of the activities that we're looking at doing as part of the Momentum Station program. So it's really, really exciting time. And as I mentioned, the Environment and Public Works Committee will be the first ones to release their draft. Their target scheduled date for that is May, which is right about the time that the current authorization is set to expire. So what we're hearing is we may see a couple months of month-by-month resolutions. They'll extend it 1 month, see if they can come up with an agreement and continue to extend it. The hope is that they actually adopt something by August. As our colleague said, the August recess, once folks return from that, is kind of the official start of campaign season. They're very worried that nothing will get done kind of long-term past that point. But I think, as Mark mentioned, there's a big focus on transportation in California. And I think nationally there's starting to be a lot of conversation on transportation and infrastructure at a national level as well. There's been several news reports. CBS did a very big story on it a few months ago. So I think we're going to see a national conversation really start to evolve. So that concludes my report.
Good morning, APC Chair Tetson. Congratulations. Brian Kelleher will be bringing this information forward today. He'll be hitting upon the highlights of the first 6 months of our fiscal year and discuss some of the adjustments that we'll be bringing forward to the board for their approval.
I guarantee this will be quick and it won't be as painful. With that said, I'll go through this as briefly as possible. I wasn't going to spend a lot of time going into all the details, but just a general overview of the budget for the mid-year. The process starts early in January, and as we go through it, a lot of our projects, the timing and the time it takes to get a lot of the invoices in usually extends into late August. So as we bring it to you in March, we are only about halfway through the year for the major parts of all of our invoices that we're receiving and the projections that we're receiving. Susan and Ross work extensively with the consultants for all the teams that they have out there working on the projects. So as we do the fiscal year budget, we come with a general plan of it's going to cost X amount to finish all these projects if we meet all these certain milestones. As we look at the revisions that we're making, $36 million reduction is a large number, but in the scale of the millions and millions of dollars or hundreds of millions of dollars that we have on these projects, it's a small amount. As you look through the revenue sources, our main source is always going to be the sales tax revenues, but federal, state, and local funds continue to grow as we start to do the AAA of all these projects. And then we have the expenditure categories that are broken out per the expenditure plan. We have the projects, the programs, the planning, and the administration, and the debt service part for our divisions. So as you can see, we've reduced $37.9 million for projects and also reduced $36.7 million in revenues. It's not due to the loss of revenues, it's due to the timing of projects and the schedules and meeting the timelines. As sales tax revenue is the bread and butter for the organization for a lot of the programs. You can see over as the recession has ended, we've continued to go uphill on the numbers. And so far 6 months to date, we've received $41.04 million. That represents about 52% of the revised budget, which is $80.4 million. Due to the increased revenues that we've received from retail and auto sales, in some of the numbers that we received from the state, our projections are going to be a little higher than our original budget. For the first 6 months, our revenues based on point of sales is about 9.2% higher than what we received last year. And in order for us to hit the $80.4 million, we'd have to have the next 6 months average about 2.8% higher than the prior fiscal year. So we've gone with a relatively conservative budget adjustment to $80.4 million. In the past, there's been some questions in regards to how do all the funding sources and the different categories make up a percentage of the revenue. This is the first 3 months data for the authority, so it would be sales in July, August, and September. And you can see that revenues have increased for construction. Retail sales are about the same. New auto sales are up 10.9%. And our leading revenue source is retail sales, followed by construction and heavy equipment, followed by new auto sales, and then there's gas tax, which represents about 10% of the total revenue for the authority. The next slide shows the federal, state, and local compared to the sales tax revenue over the last several fiscal years. And as I had mentioned before, as the authority starts to take control over a lot of the projects, we are now being the recipient of a lot of the funding sources. So that covers that piece. And then as we break down the revenue sources for the capital projects, you can kind of get a general idea of where all the funding sources are coming from. The biggest one in there is the RM2 funding. The reduction of about $16.9 million is regards to the SR4 to SR160 project was reduced about $9 million, and we had a reduction of about $5.2 million for the Caldecott Tunnel. The reduction there was we didn't anticipate the funding coming in until this year, but we actually received it last year. Proposed expenditures of $242.2 million. The original was $278.9. You can see that we reduced on the Caldecott Tunnel, BART 13.8 million, I-80 4.1. We had an increase on the capital maintenance for BART of about 2.6 million. Administration is going to be about 2.1 million. As we've increased the revenue on the sales tax, the salaries and benefits represent about 81% or 0.81% of the 1% limitation that we have. The program's budget is $55.8 million. All of that is laid out per the expenditure plan. Planning is about $6.4 million with the larger projects for the countywide transportation plan update and the priority development area investment. Debt service is the same. We have a level debt service on the bonds, which is about $28.5 million. And due to the reduction in some of the capital projects, we're also reducing the draw on the bonds about $16.6 million. That wraps it up. The sales tax revenues continue to show growth year over year. Grant funding for projects remain an important component for the capital projects. Expenditures for the projects year over year are increasing and recommend approval, or we'll be moving forward to the authority board for the approval of the resolution to adopt these changes.
Great. Thank you. Are there comments? Commissioner Arnold?
Thank you for the presentation. That was a good short version. Just a quick question on, and maybe it's semantics the way it's written, but under general administration, we're showing a $55,000 increase. It's largely due because of the document retrieval system that we're allocating. But when you read it, it looks like it's travel and everything else. I mean, just the way I read that. I was just going to suggest maybe before we move it up, maybe tweak that the reason for the increase is largely because of equipment, because it's $40,000 for that, $10,500 for some other equipment. That's most of what it is. Yeah, one-time expense, but it's also important that we get that done. But anyway, the way I read it, I thought, well, we got $40,000 in travel at first, but no, we don't. It's a couple of thousand.
Commissioner Pierce?
Otherwise, thanks.
Yeah, just real quickly, thank you, Brian. That was a good, concise report. The only request I would make would be in the staff report for those reading it. that most of these changes, particularly the decreases, are due to the timing issues. It's not that we're losing money, it's that the timing of them is playing out differently than originally anticipated. Because if you don't read this really carefully, you don't get that it's just because of which fiscal year some of these things happen in. It sounds like gobs of money were taken away. And I don't want that to be the takeaway that somebody unfamiliar with us would get. So maybe just a preamble that talks about the timing of funds, but that the authority's budget is still healthy, the projects are going forward, we're getting lots done, all that kind
on
of thing.
track.
Yeah, I just think encapsulate that so that it's a perception issue. Okay?
And I would agree with that comment, because I always think, Sky, read all the stuff on pages 6 to 8, and it's clear when you read that in detail. But I think maybe even almost a summary table where, in addition to summarizing it by project, we summarize the changes by reason. And so the reasons might include construction delays or changes in construction timing. We could have a reduction in the contributions from a source. It doesn't look like that's occurring, but it could. Our costs could be lower in a given project, and therefore we're able to bring it in under.
Highlight that.
We ought to highlight that. So I'm just saying there might be two ways to cut it. You've cut it very well by projects. You might cut it essentially by underlying reason. And then the other question I had is we talk about a category of bond proceeds and other sources. What are the other sources in there that aren't bond proceeds?
The bond proceeds and other sources are related to, obviously, the other sources are, for cities, you have reserves, and you'd never want to really dip into your reserves. But for the Transportation Authority, we have reserves and timing of projects and when programs are delivered. So we're collecting money in fiscal years, and some fiscal years you may exceed how much you're collecting in those fiscal years. So for Ped Bike, you may budget $1 million but spend $2 million. You're taking some money that you've accumulated from prior years. So the best way to explain it is you are dipping into reserves for that specific fund, but each one of these projects and programs have their own individual checkbook. So you're using accumulated funds since the measure started to pay projects that are finally getting completed.
And are the other sources Measure C or Measure J monies, or could they be from a variety of original sources?
It's a mixture of both, depending. We still have about, I want to say about $26 million of Measure C funds, so we're still drawing on those funds to pay for some of the projects as we complete them, and then there's also the programs that we're paying off as well.
Go ahead.
The balance of that would be revenue recognition. When that money comes in, we recognize it in that particular year. We don't necessarily spend it that year.
And all I'm wondering is, I'll toss this out to the committee and get a reaction, is if you looked at that first table you had, it was very clear that there's sales tax revenue. That's what the voters approved. And the bonds are clearly what we then sold using what the voters approved. And it would be nice to, in a sense, be able in a public presentation to say, here's all the voter-approved money that we used, and the other sources clouds that a little bit. And so what I'm wondering is, do you create another category, or can you move it into some other category to the extent that it's not sales tax-related funding?
I can do another quick slide, or I can do another slide for the authority meeting that breaks out maybe this year's or maybe the last couple of years of revenue and by funding category. So I can do it just for like maybe the capital projects to simplify it, so you can kind of see where, or do you want to see it for all the funding categories? So if our expenditures are $242 million, you want to see how much money goes to each group?
Well, I think this chart is fine. The only thing I would do on this is either take out the portion of other sources that aren't related to sales tax, either bonds or revenue, and including what you've held back, and just put that somewhere else. So if it was a TDA grant that we're using this year, just somehow put that in another line.
Don, I was going to say the only maybe a higher level view of that. I get what you're after, because we want to report back in a simple, concise way to our constituents and the ratepayers. But you want to do it in a way, we have been really successful in getting other monies.
Leveraging.
And our original Measure J and Measure C depended upon us getting those. We're just doing a better job.
Right.
So we're able to accomplish more. So I wouldn't want to isolate just the sales tax portion because it's just a fraction of what we're spending. So if there was a way to do a simple table that says it's the update, what we originally planned in Measure J was to accomplish this, and of those things that are occurring now, here's where we're at. But I wouldn't want to.
And I'm not suggesting we create only a Measure J. I'm just saying on this chart that if somebody wanted to look at the sales tax portions, they could identify it. And then you could explain it in two ways. One is you could say we had revenue of $242 million. 170 million of that came from what voters approved in our bonding, and the rest we were able to leverage. But I'm just looking for two numbers on that you could add up to get all the sales tax related things, and then put all the other stuff in other lines.
Well, maybe you just change that first line to say Measure J sales tax revenues.
But it's really the bonds and other sources. That's
No,
the
I
confusing
understand
part. And to me, that's projects we're doing with Measure J sales tax revenues. We just happen to convert them into bonds.
Right.
Think about it. This isn't, there's really nothing wrong with this. It's just a modest change. So, okay. Any other comments?
I'd move the item.
Right.
Move
Okay.
approval.
Motion and a second by Commissioner Arner, second by Commissioner Butt. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Okay. That brings us to our next item.
APC Commissioner Tatson, Randy Carlton, CFO. I'll move quickly through this item. It's seeking approval from the APC to recommend to the board our investment banking pool that was selected through an RFP process. There are 7 firms listed here that really do represent a good cross-section of national, regional, and even local banking presence. We look primarily at those banking firms that operate in the sales tax transportation type space, look for banks that are heavily capitalized because we are talking about large sums of money here. And when it comes time to sell bonds, we want to make sure that we have a bank partner that can underwrite those bonds in a potential market that might not be as smooth. And we're looking to have the bank take down a good chunk of the bonds if that should be necessary. However, we have carved out about 10% of one of our bond transactions for a local firm that happens to be a small business, a certified small business enterprise and a women-owned business enterprise. And we have Jerry here representing Alamo Capital that's located here in Walnut Creek. But our experience has been very positive with this approach of establishing a pool of bankers. Logistically, there are a lot of banks out there. If we have just a limited number of banks, following the authority, understanding our objectives, and giving us information along the way, that we find that's a far more efficient use of our time instead of doing an RFP every time that we have a particular type of banking need. The firms that are being recommended have been vetted through a selection process. They're listed on page 12.3, including Alamo Capital, Bank of America Merrill Lynch, Barclays, Citi, Morgan Stanley, RBC Capital, Wells Fargo Securities. Some familiar names from the prior pool, but also some new names that we're bringing forward. Morgan Stanley in particular is a firm that you'll see more of as we bring forward our next transaction. We have in the hopper the need to refinance our 2012A bonds. We're looking at a refinancing of the 2012B bonds, or fixed rate bonds, with the interest rates a little lower. There's a potential that we could save some money there. And then we have a new money transaction sometime between the July and December timeframe to raise an additional $75 to $100 million. So it's with staff recommendation that you approve of these banks. You're approving of the executive director to utilize this pool as needed over the next 5 years.
Thank you. Are there questions? Commissioner Arnott?
Yeah, just sort of curiosity. So this comes from APC. Why doesn't it just go to the board and then we vote on it? Because we're sending it to us, then we all end up voting on it, and it still comes to the board. So we've already voted. I missed something. Did I?
We're seeking the APC's recommendation to the board to vote approval.
Yeah.
We just forward it to the authority for approval. We vetted it, then we recommend it.
Okay.
We're not approving.
And this
We're
could.
recommending.
Yeah, right.
This
Okay.
could
The way I
appear
was
on the-
reading, I thought we're
this
just
could appear on the
recommending.
consent
Okay.
calendar for the authority for.
And
It
move
will
the
be on
item.
consent. Yeah.
I'm glad to see the
Well,
list. I like
okay,
some of the names
motion,
on there.
Commissioner Taylor had a comment.
Yeah, the term of this is 5 years. Why not 3, or why not 7? Why not 1? I mean, obviously we wouldn't do 1, but who determined the 5 years and for what purpose?
That's a staff determination and what we're recommending. 5 years has worked for us before. The last pool that we had for 5 years and served us well. And this next period of time, probably 5 years is the window that we have left of when we'll be issuing bonds as an agency. Unless we have an extension, we probably won't have any other bond business beyond a 5-year period.
All right. There's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Second by Commissioner Taylor. Any further discussion? Any public comment? All those in favor, please say aye. 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 Right, so it's forwarded to the authority, and I assume that was for the consent calendar. It was. And that brings us to our next item, which is a proposed layout for our periodic financial reports.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman and committee members. My name is Hisham Noemi. Currently, the authority receives monthly project status reports on all active Measure C and J projects. In addition, we provide you with quarterly project funding plans on all the projects on the state highway system that we manage. We would like to streamline the process and reduce paper, so we are proposing a new format that combines information from both reports and provides an easier way for you to identify changes on a quarterly basis. The new report will be titled the Quarterly Project Status Reports. We are seeking your approval of the format and reporting period for this report. With your approval, the new report will be presented in July, and we will do away with the other 2 reports starting next month.
Are there comments?
I like this.
Move approval.
I like it too.
Second.
There's a motion by Commissioner Pierce, second by Commissioner Arnott. I just had a question. I like it as well. The example of the Interstate 80 San Pablo Dam Road interchange, not pick on that project, but how would I know, in addition to what's been spent or what's been authorized, how much has been spent, and what is the estimate to complete this project?
The estimate to complete will be, the cost you have in the table, the estimated cost by phase, that's the latest cost we have on the project. Now, we haven't gone to the contractor community for a bids on the construction contract, so they are still estimates.
And I'm not, again, focused on this project. I'm just thinking conceptually, a project may have areas of issues of concern which haven't resulted in change orders or increases in project costs yet, but you sort of think they're going to. And it wasn't clear to me how we would see that in this format.
Yeah, let me take that, if you don't mind, Chair. Raj Chittenden, Deputy Executive Director. There's a couple of ways we could do that. One common way might be on the second sheet. A lot of times you see a red, green, yellow type of designation. Here we don't print in color, so we maybe do a symbol or something like that, and that flags it. If you want to see just purely the expenditures or progress, we can do kind of thermometer bars and show, you have $1 million and we've spent $600,000 and we expect we're going to spend $900,000, which is good, or 1.1, which we have to fix. So we could bring back a couple of examples on how to do that. But as I hear what you're saying is you want to be able to say not only what they're going to cost when we're done, but where are we today compared to where we thought we'd be today. And it kind of ties a little bit back into the budget discussion. You know, we said we were going to spend X, and we spent something different. And what's the reason for that? This would give you a kind of a heads up before you see in the budget.
Could that also include where we are in the schedule?
Sure.
I mean, you could do kind of your thermometer bar idea as kind of a bar chart, and here's the total project, and here's where we are in this point in time, percent of schedule, percent of amount spent, which is one of the things that Randy noted in one of the, I think it was Randy, anyways, it was noted on one of the projects that, we're 80% done with the project, but only spent 78% of the dollars appropriated, and that gives us an idea of how we're maybe being more efficient with our spending.
So actually, this is a great example. If we can keep the text to this much, we've got a bunch of white space here, so we'll fill up the white space with something that tells you the story.
There you go.
All right, so is the maker of the motion and the second willing?
Yep.
Agree to that amendment? Okay. Any other discussion? All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Okay, so that brings us to communication items, or any item anyone would wish to discuss? Okay, seeing none. Commissioner and staff comments? Any staff comments? And other business? All right, so we're going to move into closed session for review of the executive director.
I think he's going to make
Randy
sure we all
Carlton
get it.
sent it out.
Right.
I don't have it either.
Okay, so we've come out of closed session. We've taken no action, but we did continue our meeting to noon on March 10th. And so if you could arrange to have that noticed, please. Right, the APC meeting
We're
is
going to have
continued.
a continued closed session
Continued closed session to March 10th,
at noon.
right, at noon.
You need a piece of paper?
Carlton.
Yes, I'll get one sent to you.
All right, would you do that?
Yeah.
I'll send it to.
So do we
Actually,
need
maybe, well, it's a serial meeting if you do that.
Right, so
We'll get it from Randy.
Christina, can you have Randy Carlton resend the review
Evaluation,
forms, the
right.
evaluation forms to the entire committee, because a couple didn't get it?
Right, and I'm new, so if you could also, yeah, so we're now adjourned.
Yes.